It all began with a half-joking dare over coffee. "Why not just let the animals run the farm for a day?" my friend said, laughing. I laughed too, until the idea refused to leave my head. I've always prided myself on being in tune with the rhythms of nature, but this was next level. Letting the animals, my cows, chickens, goats, pigs, dogs, and even a few mischievous ducks, take full control for 24 hours. It sounded like chaos wrapped in fur and feathers. But it also sounded like a story worth telling. So, armed with cameras, extra feed, and a ridiculous amount of optimism, I made the decision, for one full day, I would step back. No schedules. No commands. Just pure, unfiltered animal autonomy. Whatever happened to the crops, happened. Dawn broke over the horizon in a soft blush of orange, and I opened the barn doors with a theatrical flourish. The animals hesitated at first, probably wondering if I'd lost my mind. Then, with a collective surge, they stormed into the fields like preschoolers released for recess. The chickens were the first to make a beeline for the corn rows. Normally confined to their coop or carefully supervised on walkabouts, today they strutted down the crop lines with swagger. Pecking and scratching like feathered little anarchists, they weren't so much harvesting corn as staging a revolution against agricultural order. Yet as they pecked, I noticed something odd. They were primarily targeting the insect-ridden stalks. Could they actually be improving the crop by eliminating pests? Meanwhile, the goats had found the compost heap and were having what can only be described as a 5-star buffet. While I fretted over what half of my kitchen scraps might now be lost to their bottomless stomachs, I soon realized they were spreading the compost unintentionally across the edges of the garden bed. It wasn't tidy. It wasn't elegant. But it was effective. Their hooves stomped it into the soil as they danced and kicked in delight. I imagined little pockets of unexpected fertility cropping up in places I hadn't planned to plant. Was this chaos or creativity? The cows, my gentle giants, were more interested in lounging than leading. But when they did move, they wandered into the pasture and toward the orchard. I braced myself for broken branches and trampled seedlings. Instead, they nosed around the trees delicately, munching on fallen apples and clearing the area beneath each tree. Their heavy bodies compacted the soil in ways that made me nervous, but I recalled certain traditional farming methods where livestock were used to prepare soil before planting. Maybe they knew something I didn't. They didn't touch the budding apple blossoms or the younger saplings. It was almost as if they understood. And then there were the pigs. If chaos had a mascot, it would be a piglet covered in mud, grinning ear to ear. They dug trenches, rolled in puddles, and rooted under the squash vines like they were on a treasure hunt. I had expected them to destroy everything in their path, and they did, to an extent. But here's the thing about pigs, their rooting actually aerated the soil. In the aftermath of their rampage, the damaged vines were few, but the soil was looser, moister, and oddly healthier. And the areas they frequented had fewer weeds by the end of the day. Nature's rototillers in action. My dogs, usually my sidekicks in all things farm-related, seemed confused by my absence from command. But they adjusted quickly, slipping into the role of peacekeepers. When a chicken wandered too far, they nudged it gently back toward the coop. When the pigs got a little too rowdy near the irrigation line, the dogs barked, not in warning, but as if to say, maybe not there, buddy. Their patrols weren't perfect, but their instinct to maintain balance was uncanny. They weren't herding by command. They were policing by intuition. Even the ducks, which I'd mostly considered cute but useless, found their purpose. They waddled to the rice paddies, dipping their bills into the shallow water and stirring up pests that hid beneath the surface. I'd heard of duck-rice symbiosis in Asian farming methods, but seeing it firsthand on my own land was mind-blowing. They left behind cleaner paddies, fewer insects, and a bizarrely satisfying trail of webbed footprints. I began to wonder how much of what we call farm management is just us trying to outdo what nature already perfected. As the sun climbed higher, I sat on the porch, both terrified and fascinated. Cameras recorded every moment. The crops, the animals, the soil, none of it was going the way I expected, but none of it felt like failure either. If anything, it felt like the farm had exhaled, stretching into a form it had always wanted to take when not restrained by human micromanagement. Yes, some corn was pecked away. A few squash vines were mangled. But overall, the damage was minimal. In some places, it looked like progress. By late afternoon, the energy shifted. The initial rush of freedom mellowed into a sort of lazy contentment. The chickens gathered in shady patches, sunbathing in dusty bowls they'd scratched out. The goats lay on their sides chewing cud, bellies full and satisfied. The cows returned to the barn on their own, as if they'd decided the day's work was done. The pigs, muddy and triumphant, settled near the wallow and fell asleep snorting. Even the ducks seemed more graceful in their final waddles back toward the pond. And the dogs, tired but proud, curled up on the porch beside me, tails thumping quietly. As dusk approached, I took a slow walk through the fields. I expected to feel regret, maybe guilt over what had been disrupted. Instead, I felt awe. The cornfields, though pecked at, had clearer rows thanks to the chickens weeding. The compost had been spread wider than I'd dared try on my own. The orchard looked tidier, the soil in the garden looser, and the air, was it just my imagination or was it actually more fragrant? There was an energy in the land, like it had been reinvigorated by a dose of primal anarchy. Of course, not everything was perfect. A few tomato cages were knocked over. The lettuce beds had been nibbled almost to stumps. And someone, probably a goat, had chewed on the corner of my garden shed. But these were minor setbacks compared to what I'd feared. The structural integrity of the farm held. The crops weren't ruined. In fact, many looked healthier, as if they'd been stimulated by the change. It was as though the disruption had jolted them into growth. Nightfall came gently. I herded everyone back with a mix of treats and tired smiles. No one resisted. It felt less like an ending and more like a group returning from a long, shared adventure. As I latched the barn doors and did one last round through the property, I couldn't help but laugh, part disbelief, part relief. I'd handed over an entire farm to a band of animals, and somehow, it hadn't just survived, it had thrived. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. Frame by frame, I watched the madness unfold. Chickens forming temporary alliances, goats clambering atop hay bales like conquering heroes, pigs creating a rhythmic pattern of root dig sleep root. But I also saw collaboration, instinctual zoning, problem solving. I watched my animals not just exist in the space, but engage with it. It wasn't random. It wasn't dumb luck. It was behavior born of evolutionary knowledge. Without realizing it, I had given my farm a day to reset through its oldest caretakers, its animals. So, what happened to the crops? They lived. Some even flourished. But more importantly, something happened to me. I remembered why I became a farmer, not to control, but to collaborate. To listen. To observe. Nature doesn't need us to dominate it. It needs us to participate. And for one wild, muddy, beautiful day, I did just that, from the sidelines. And would I do it again? Absolutely. Maybe not every week. Maybe not for another full 24 hours. But I've already made space in my routine for animal-led hours. Controlled chaos might just be the best farmhand I've ever hired.